Yep, I've done that.
Hello, this is Amy Wheeler, and I am here with Per Erez today, and just so excited to introduce you to this wonderful human being. But first, I want to thank Give Back Yoga for co-producing this podcast, and you can visit them at givebackyoga.org and just type in Yoga Therapy Hour with Amy Wheeler, and basically you can see all the upcoming guests that we have. We have guests ready to go for almost a year in advance, so you can see who your favorite teachers are coming up. And you can also go there to watch replays of this podcast in an archive. So the other thing is, if you'd like to join us live on future podcasts to ask questions of our guests, feel free to sign up before Thursday afternoon, and then you can actually come in here and be with us as we're taping this and ask questions. And of course, all of the profits from your participation and basically giving back to Give Back Yoga, that goes to help so many different 501c3 organizations that are helping to bring yoga to diverse populations. The other thing I would love to invite you to is a free Facebook group that allows us to go in and discuss the content of this podcast and what each guest brings each week. So the Facebook group is called Yoga Therapy Hour with Amy Wheeler, and we would love to have you come join us. We're only 2 weeks in, and we already have 400 people in that group ready to have great discussions. Last, I just want to say that we had a generous donation this month to help us get started, because this is our third episode, and that was from Teddy's Heart, which is an organization, that another nonprofit that supports animals and their people, and especially helping animals get the integrated veterinary care that they need, and also providing training, sheltering, rescuing, any kind of support for the animals and their human families. So if you'd like to pay it forward, go to teddysheart.org and thank them for helping us get going on the podcast. So now I just want to introduce you to one of my favorite people that I actually met through Facebook. I remember the day I met Per Erez, and I saw this human being doing somatics, and I think you had taken a 60 or 90-minute class of you lying on the floor doing all sorts of somatic movement, and then shrunk it down into 60 seconds, and I was hooked. I was like, I want to take that class. So I remember just randomly figuring out who you were, and signing up for your noon class on, I think it was Wednesdays or something. And we've been friends ever since. So Per, welcome to the podcast. We're so happy you're here today to talk about embodiment, about somatics, and then the experience of being a queer man, an embodied queer man in the field of yoga and yoga therapy. So we're really grateful that you're here. Would you like to say hello before I tell them a little bit about you?
Oh, absolutely. Amy, I know you first before you knew me, I suspect, because one of my former students, a teacher in her own right, would always talk about you, this woman, Amy, that she'd talk about. And the comments were so glowing. This is Ruth, of course. Were so glowing. I thought, oh, I need to meet this woman. I need to meet this woman. And then you were, of course, the president of IAYT. And it's like, okay, well, now I know who she is. So thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Great. Well, Per, I just want to start off by congratulating you, because everyone in the field of yoga therapy is really struggling to find work, and they're wanting to get paid for this beautiful offering and service to the world. And you recently have had 2 job offers, and you're starting, you've been with one and starting another. So I just want to mention that things are starting to happen in our field. One of your jobs you can tell us a little bit about is at the Mindfulness Center, and that's in Maryland. And then another one is the Mind Body Co-op. You're the director of somatic interventions. So, do you want to tell us just a little bit about that to give people some hope that jobs are starting to pop up and we will be able to make a living doing this work?
I sure hope so. And my impression is that you're absolutely right. The jobs are beginning to resurface again. We're more in need than we certainly were in the past, especially considering where we've been in the last year, right?
Right.
So my specific role here in Chicago at the Mind Body Co-op is as the director of somatic interventions. And basically what that means, it seems like a lot of words for a small role, at least in my mind, but an important role is to make sure that the psychotherapists there primarily are getting an opportunity to meet their own somatic needs, their own bodily needs for regulation and for support and self-soothing. And so that's one way I think about the job that I'm doing there at Mind Body Co-op. So I meet on a regular basis with the psychotherapist, art therapist, dance therapist, and I offer them an opportunity to, to move away from their clients a little bit and to talk about their own needs, maybe sometimes also talk about their needs as it relates to their clients, and help. As a collective, we look at ways of talking about addressing the things that they see that maybe they're not quite there yet because their field is primarily in psychotherapeutics. So, and my focus is on, somatics. So it's a really interesting model, I think, and I really love the work thus far.
Well, and I think this should,
The position,
oh, can I just say, I think that
yeah,
position of helping healthcare workers is so important. And I hope every organization starts to think about that because their people are getting burnt out and they have to listen all day long to people who have really serious problems. And so providing support for healthcare workers, psychologists, it makes sense if they want people to stick around for the job. And like you said, we'll
exactly. I
talk.
mean,
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say exactly. Burnout is so huge in the wellness and healthcare fields. And I talked to a woman today during supervision, and it's not regular, but she said, I have 3 days and I see 24 clients. I can't imagine that kind of load, right? So it's a little bit that we're doing, but it's so crucial. So yeah.
And we'll talk more about that somatic experience and what it means to get people out of their head and into their bodies. But we'll save that because I want to hear about the second position that you're also working in.
Yeah, so the Mindfulness Center is a similarly oriented. The reason why I decided to take both of these positions, I'm not a glutton for punishment, trust me, but my advisor, Eleanor Criswell, I approached her and told her what I was thinking about doing, and she said, why don't you consider taking both of those positions? I think that might be really good for you. And at first I thought, okay, I'm crazy for considering it, and she's even crazier for suggesting it. And then I thought about it more, and I realized, well, to some degree, they're similar kind of setups. Both of these positions work with a lot of psychotherapeutic or psychoeducational model, but there, the context in Bethesda, Maryland, is more for clients. And so the work I'll be doing there is as a master faculty member and teacher. So I'll be offering somatic education programming, probably yoga therapeutics and Tai Chi as well, I suspect. I'm a multi-certified kind of guy. And I think this is a wonderful way of, really using my skills. So I'm really looking forward to it.
It is amazing. And let's just remind people, you've been in the business for 40 years or something. I mean,
No, but I've been practicing for over 30, but I've been teaching, I'd say solidly for the last 25. So.
And are you willing to talk about your early days at the health club in Chicago and the famous people that you got to teach there, or is that kind of off limits?
Not off limits. I don't know. I don't know how interesting it is for people. But I do get that question often. So you know, I began. My first teacher taught at like 5 or 6 different health clubs. You know, and so she was very sneaky. Hannah Hedrick. She said, you know what? Why don't you come and I'll be about 15 minutes late and I'll take the class once I get there. Well, she would just not show up, right? And later on, I really discovered that this was her way of slowly pushing me out of the nest. And then she finally one day just said, okay, well, I'm leaving. I'm going to move to Hawaii. Would you consider taking these classes on? So I took several of her health club classes, and I took a class at a HIV and AIDS social service agency where I eventually became an employee as well. So that's kind of how I got started teaching yoga and Tai Chi specifically. Yeah, and in the health clubs, you know, I taught at a place pretty well known in Chicago, maybe also pretty known nationally, at least, called the East Bank Club, where I worked with Oprah Winfrey and a couple of the, you know, the basketball players and Penny Pritzker and, you know, some of the highfalutin folk of the world. Those are good days for me.
I guess it was the early 90s, I lived in downtown Chicago and I worked right on Wacker Drive. And I remember walking by the East Bank Club. I don't even remember what street it was on, but I remember thinking, wow, I'd love to go in there. All right. Well, today we're wanting to talk about embodiment, somatics, which is very much related to the somatic experience that we have in our bodies. But I would just like to ask you, what does embodiment mean to you? Because you had just talked about the psychologists who are doing talk therapy, how good it is for you to help them get into their bodies.
You know, that's interesting. What does embodiment mean? Just the other day, a psychotherapist friend of mine, colleague of mine, posted something about, you know, what does it mean to be embodied? And a slew of people responded. And my response, and bear with me here, I'll try to dig into it a little bit, is embodiment is any orienting practice or focus that establishes presence. And the presence is in the material realm, but it can also be sensorial, right? So there's this 2-directional flow to it as well. And, you know, presence is both non-temporal as well as out of time. I suddenly have a fly in my studio. It's very rare. So speaking of embodiment, makes you really aware of where you are in space. Yeah, so that's kind of how I think of what embodiment is. It's the ability to be aware of both your interior experience and the exterior realm around you, the environment around you. One without the other doesn't work, generally speaking, not for very long. And there's also a piece where, and I think this is where we're not necessarily going to talk, well, I don't know what we're going to talk about, but I'm not suggesting we should talk about trauma, but when people do talk about trauma, it's usually, there are 2 things now that I think about it, and my mind works really fast, Amy. I'll try to slow down.
We know each other well. You're the Vata butterfly. Yeah. I'm the Pitta Kapha elephant. We're good. You can land on my trunk or my back. It's fine.
Okay. So it's interesting to me that both trauma and meditation have that same relationship, at least as I think about it, because they're both experiences that are out of time and out of body, right? For many people, at least, the experience of meditation takes them out of themselves to a certain degree, and trauma does the same thing. So I think there's, when we talk about being embodied or the somatic experience, we're talking about a practice, an orienting practice that directs you somewhere along those lines. Hopefully it's towards the body and then externally, and away from things that would cause the nervous system to dysregulate. Hopefully that's not too.
No, it makes complete sense. I mean, I was talking to
Okay.
Matt Erb, who's kind of a specialist in this area too, and he was saying something to the effect of, embodiment has to do with our internal experience and being able to pay attention to what's happening inside of us as a response or even a reaction to what's happening out there, right? And so many of us get drawn out of our physical sensation of, everything from the neck down to all the senses going out, and we no longer can stay present, as you said, to what's happening in here so that we can self-regulate. Does that sound like what you were saying in different words?
It does indeed. I completely concur with that.
Yeah, so I kind of want to go back and forth a little bit, because you are a certified yoga therapist through the IOIT and you are a somatics educator. I want to talk about both of those. I get this question a lot. What's the difference between yoga therapy and somatics? So I pulled up a few definitions and I want to see if you agree. This definition is from the IAYT. It's their newest one that they put out about 6 months ago. Yoga therapy is the professional application of the principles and practices of yoga to promote health and well-being within a therapeutic relationship that includes a personalized assessment, goal setting, lifestyle management, and yoga practices for individuals or small groups. So there's a pretty, yoga therapy is a small niche within the greater world of yoga, right? And then what I have been looking up about somatics, it describes any practice that uses mind-body connection to help you survey your internal self and then listen to the signals that your body sends about areas of pain, discomfort, or imbalance. And these somatic practices allow you to access more information about the ways you hold on to your experiences in your body. What do you think of that? Do you agree with that? Do you like that definition? Or do you want to add more to it?
I like that definition for somatics. You have to keep in mind, akin to yoga, somatics and somatic education, there are a lot of different ways of parsing this out. It's actually pretty solidly based in like early 1890s. It's been around since at least the late 1800s, and so there are lots of different rivulets to this river of somatic wisdom, and some of them would definitely agree with that definition, and some of them would go a little bit further along the lines of including assessment that you talked about in yoga therapeutics, right? And so there's a lot of overlap, I think, places where these two overlap, and clearly somatic yoga, which is a burgeoning cross-disciplinary approach to these, is one area where that certainly is happening.
And you've studied for years extensively with Eleanor Criswell, and her somatic yoga is combining somatics, yoga, neuroscience, applied psychophysiology, and psychology. So that's what you've been studying for the last how many years, right?
For the last 4 years, for sure. And, I've been chomping around. I say I've been chewing on the bones for the last 20 years, because I got introduced to Hana somatic education back in 2000, I want to say it was 2000, actually. So it's been about 20 years. I wasn't ready to study it back at that point. I was just beginning to make the transition to yoga therapeutics. So it's taken me a bit of time.
Right. So, I want to hear about somatics, because I've experienced it from you, and I think it it's so potent. It's a very, if you're a yoga therapist, it's a nice adjunct if you want to study a little more and get some continuing education. And I've really been trying to pinpoint, this is my little scientific mind, pinpointing, what do you think the mechanism is that's promoting such amazing interoception or interoceptive awareness when we practice somatics? Can you pinpoint that, or is it many things that cause us to really be able to go inward and connect with ourselves deeply and feel our own bodies?
Hmm. Um, my way of looking at it is similar to yoga therapy in the sense that if you take, so for a lot of the time when I'm working with people in a yoga therapy, when I've got my yoga therapy hat on, the process is primarily about me looking at them looking at me, and that empty space, which is a pause in between, where that's where the magic happens, right? That pause point. So I think similarly in the world of the soma, there's a pause point, and that shows up typically as slowing slowing down to the level of the body. I mean, my mind certainly moves really fast, but when I'm really deeply embodied, I move insanely slow. And some of that's, my Buto practice, which is a form of Japanese dance. But I just, I've always loved, Tai Chi, just really slow movement, because it's so good for my nervous system, right?
Well,
And I
that's
think
what I'm
it's that
getting at.
slow movement.
Yeah, that's what I'm
Yeah,
getting at. That, I think the mechanism, whether it's yoga therapy or somatics, I know many people have different styles of yoga therapy, so it's not a blanket statement, but the way that I like to practice, it is about that slowness, that stillness, the coordinated breath and movement, which is very regulating to our nervous system. And I always say the superpower of a yoga therapist is to help people take their nervous system from dysregulation into a more regulated state and learn how to do that for themselves. Would you agree?
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And we've got lots and lots of tools and lots of techniques, and there are different branches of somatics. I wouldn't akin to yoga therapy, the yoga therapy world. There are traditions that are not necessarily slow. Buto is a form of somatics, for example, but it is, and there are other forms of dance that are considered somatic. So it's not that everyone moves slow. I don't want to give that impression, but I think in terms of a wellness practice, I wouldn't say clinical, but a wellness-based practice where you're intuiting and listening inwardly, that requires a little bit of slowing down and moving at the pace of the body and not at the pace of the mind, not at the pace of our 21st century world, for sure.
And so, I learned somatics with you on Zoom, like so many of us are. And, you're watching us and using language to help us explore our inner experience for 90 minutes. And, you and we've laughed because there's been times where like you're saying, externally rotate your leg and extend your foot. And I've got like my leg over on the other side, wrong leg. And you just very gently and kindly, maybe you say something, or maybe you wait for me to figure it out on my own. Because when we go to the second side, I'm going to realize I was just totally out on my own, So tell me a little bit about that languaging. I mean, it used to, I'm sure, be that you could be in person and maybe touch or be there to support someone, with gestures. But tell me about the language and how important that is in helping a psychologist, a nurse, a teacher like myself to find our own interoceptive awareness inside of us.
Amy, the biggest difference I think between, I think this is also true. I wouldn't make it a blanket statement, but I think it's also in generally true of yoga therapy. and somatics compared to other forms of body-based physical culturing. When we address the body, we're addressing the body as a individual, as a unique process in motion, embedded in time and space, that's unique, i.e. a soma, right? The root word of that we get to. And that makes the biggest difference. You're not using language that dissects someone into a muscle or fascia or bones or whatever. I mean, certainly those elements of a person are there, you know, we're not denying that. And we certainly work with those, but that's not what I'm working with. I'm working with Amy, or I'm working with Joe Bob, or whoever the person might be. And my language hopefully reflects that fact in reality, so that subtly the person's beginning to cue in on, lift your right arm, not the right arm or not a right arm, it's yours, you know, and there's no better way to ground it, you know, into reality. And it takes a little, you know, because we tend to be very kind of logic oriented and think that dissecting and, you know, the kind of reductionist model of languaging the body as pieces and parts which does make some sense. I'm not poo-pooing it. I'm just saying, when you really meet a human being, you're not meeting their arm or their leg. You're meeting all of them, and your language has to reflect that. So that's what I've been studying with Eleanor for the last 4 or 5 years, just making that switch in my own brain, right? And it's a constant work in progress. There are times when I fall back on language I might have used as a yoga teacher, for example, you know.
And I, you know, just from my experience of studying with you, it really was that. It was, you were taking the entire Amy, the one who doesn't want to listen to anybody tell her what to do and wants to do it her own way and thinks she knows better. And I think Per messed up on his side, so I'm just going to do it right, only to find out Per did not mess up and Amy did it wrong, right? You're taking the whole of Amy, and I can honestly say that because you weren't constantly correcting me and saying, Amy, wrong side, how come, get it together? That organic experience of me figuring out that you were keeping me safe and that I wasn't listening very well. And, you know, it would have been fine too if I wanted to do my own thing. You're not, you know, dogmatic or anything. But the point is, that was a really potent experience for the wholeness of Amy to have. And instead of, Amy, get your leg in the right place. You see what I'm saying?
There's a certain kind of, absolutely, there's a kind of humility that I think I didn't learn going through, I hate to say this, I didn't learn it going through yoga therapy school. Yoga therapy for me was wonderful. I learned a lot, but I don't know that I necessarily, when I was studying to learn all of this information, right? All these facts so that I could apply them. When I switched and went to somatic education, I had to learn how to undo some of that and realize the place at which I meet someone isn't about me, it's about them. And so if they choose their left arm, and I've said it a couple of times, the right arm, there's something going on there that maybe I'm not, you know, that's not about me. Let them have their experience, good, bad, or indifferent. There's as much to be learned doing it that way.
There is, about our Vijnanamaya layer, or our personality layer. That's, and you know, from the tradition that you and I have both studied in some with the TKV Desikachar, your personality layer is where all the transformation happens. So for me to get to see myself not listening and doing my own thing and being in charge, that's change on the personality layer was actually way more potent of an experience than the hip opener I was doing, which was lovely too.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I love what you said about, I'm sorry that your yoga therapy school, you learn lots of stuff that is wonderful stuff to learn and all the competencies. But I too believe, you know, as the director of a yoga therapy school, I don't want to graduate anyone who isn't going back and unlearning all of the, you know, the check marks of, I got this chapter and I got a 10 on that quiz, and here I am, I've handed in my paper. I mean, yes, we have to do all that. But what I want to see people come out with is what you're talking about, which is a big shift and towards humility and their own connection with self. You see what I'm saying? Like if
Absolutely.
we're not training yoga
Absolutely.
therapists to do that, how can they then come forward and be present unless they're just,
Mm,
have that innate ability?
yeah.
So it's interesting. All right. So there's another thing I wanted to ask you about, a couple of things regarding yoga therapy and somatics. One is this idea of pandiculation that I hadn't heard until I came to your classes. Do you want me to read a description, or do you feel like you have one just kind of, I didn't tell you any of the questions for this interview, by the way. So poor Per is like, what is she throwing at me? So I looked one up, but if you want to explain it in common terms, I'd hand the mic over to you.
You know what? Would it be okay if I explained it with a
Yep.
visual? Because I've been doing this a lot, and I think it makes what seems like a really kind of heady idea more relatable.
Sure, I'd love it.
Everybody's seen one of these, right? These
What is
wonderful
that thing called?
Huberman. It's a Huberman sphere, right?
Huberman
And
sphere.
so, yeah, at least that's one of the names for them. There are a couple of different names for them, but that's the one that I know, Huberman sphere. And they're used a lot for displaying biotensegrity, right? That's what a lot of people use them for. I like to use it to explain a pandiculation because I think it's easier than me rattling on with these really long-winded terms for it that still leave people kind of, their eyes are glossed over. So basically, if you imagine this as muscle fiber, right? And what happens with a muscle is it contracts and then it should relax. That's what should happen, right? Typically, what happens for many of us, though, we have preferences in our lives and we have stressors and we sometimes get traumatized. And so a muscle will contract around those issues and then it won't relax, right? And then you'll add something to it. You might try to stretch it, for example, in a traditional yoga class, and it will stay contracted a little bit more. And eventually, this is a really big one, it gets so contracted, you can't even see me through it now, right? So what we do with a pandiculation is we take a contracted muscle, we contract it just a little bit so that you can feel the next level of contraction. And then we invite you to relax the muscle below the original threshold of the contraction. Then we contract it a little bit more. And then we relax down a little bit more. Then we contract a little bit and relax a little bit more until eventually the muscle is completely relaxed, or as completely relaxed as it's going to be. Most muscles have to have a little bit of what's it called, piezoelectric current in order to function properly. So there's always going to be a little bit of tone to a muscle. You never have completely flaccid muscles, for example, but it shouldn't be so toned that you can't relax back down to a base layer of contraction. And that's good tone, good muscle tone. That's pandiculation.
Beautiful, beautiful description. And, that was such an interesting concept to me that I hadn't really thought about before, that when a muscle is kind of stuck in, maybe a short tight position or even a long tight position, that stretching it is not the answer, right? So many of us just want to go in and stretch, and it does feel good because if you go in and stretch, say in pigeon pose, and stay there for a while, there is a reset of the nervous system, but it doesn't actually, like you said, release the tension, the baseline tension, and bring it down over time. So I just think
Right.
that's interesting.
Yeah, and it maybe one of the reasons why it took me 20 years to get to this is because I had been practicing traditional yoga for so long, right? Where more or less, at least the initial idea is yoga is about stretching. Well, it takes a little more nuance than that. And you and I both are on that plane. It's not just about stretching. There's a lot more that goes on in yoga. But for many common people, when we start a practice of yoga, that's what they come to us for. I need, my hamstrings, you've heard this, my hamstrings are tight. And so you stretch them and they're still tight when you're done. Pandiculation actually elongates the muscle fiber so that it actually is reset in a more relaxed way.
In coordination with your nervous system, right?
Because in coordination with your nervous system, absolutely.
So
what it's your nervous system that controls the muscle.
That's right, right. And so just give us a very brief example of like, what does a pandiculation move look like? Can you just show us one so that we can?
Sure, I can show you a very simple one. One that I did a couple of weeks ago with a woman who's the editor of a HIV/AIDS service agency's journal, right? And so she sits at her desk for hours at a time, and she does this, right? So one shoulder is really stuck. And so rather than saying, get that shoulder down, right? We don't invite the shoulder to come down. We say, okay, this is your natural spot right now. Can you contract it a little bit more? And now relax it. Because that way, if you force it down, it's just going to come right back up, right? This is the way it feels. So if you relax it down after you've drawn it up a couple of times, you'll reset the natural length of the muscle there. And it just feels so good. It just feels really good.
It sure does. I mean, it's basically using eccentric contraction, wouldn't you say?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. There's a certain similarity to an eccentric contraction. I think Eleanor would probably quibble a little bit about that. But, for most people, that's an easy access point because all of the, the defining characteristics, that stuff is for the eggheads a little bit.
But just to give people an idea, the difference between a concentric contraction versus the eccentric, the muscle fibers are lengthening slowly, but there's a little bit of resistance as it's lengthening. So that it's just, you'd think it'd be eccentric elongation, but it's not because there's a little bit of resistance from gravity or something.
It's gravity, exactly. And so in person, we use the same principles, but sometimes it's more helpful for people in an in-person session to actually bring your hand to the area where they've got the contraction, right?
Right.
So now you can feel the hand and you invite them to press into your hand, and then you keep the load that you've built with them and help them to relax the muscle even more. So the pandiculation can be there are lots of different variations of this. There's what we would call a reflexive pandiculation that happens with all animals, all mammals, I should say. And then there's a conscious volitional pandiculation, which we can choose to do as higher mammals. And then you can do that for yourself, as I've been talking about, and you can do it for someone, assisted pandiculation.
It's just such a beautiful concept that I think, at least in the worlds of yoga therapy, and I don't know as much about the somatic world, but it's underutilized. And there's so many of us suffering from chronically tight neck or low back or hip or, quadricep or something. And taking your class and, doing things with Eleanor has really, really helped me to understand my body in a different way, which I'm really grateful for. So
yeah, I think it's beginning to slowly creep in, though. I think, somatic education in general, there are many threads that are beginning to intertwine between the traditions of somatics, as well as between somatics and yoga therapy and yoga in general. So you will see a lot more of it, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're talking about embodiment today, about interoceptive awareness, about coming home to yourself and really feeling and being and having presence to yourself and all the internal sensations and the felt sense within us. And one of the things that we talked about a few weeks ago when we were kind of planning for this interview is the fact that you have been a queer Black man in the field of yoga for a long, long time. And, there's not that many men, there's not that many Black men, and there's not that many Black men who are queer publicly in our field. So I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how that has been for you in this world of yoga that's dominated by white women, basically, in the US at least. I mean, hopefully that's
I
changing,
was
of
going to say
course.
in the U.S.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
In the U.S.,
I'm
that's certainly the case.
hoping that that's changing, but that's been kind of maybe what you've had to put up with for a long, long time.
Put up with and recognize that it's the ocean in which I swim, and so I think it's important to learn how to recognize that there are beauties in every ocean,
Mm-hmm.
right? As well as some sharks too. So yeah, it's because it's the water in which I swim. There's a piece about this that until maybe the last 15, 20 years, I didn't really, it's like, yeah, of course it's all women. Of course they're all white. Why are you, what? It's not that I didn't recognize it. It's just that it's what it is, right? It's only been probably in the last 20 years, I'd say, where it feels like, you know what? Maybe we could make a little more space at the table for other voices. And I think that's happening. I see it happening for sure, especially with women of color. My identity as a queer man of color, queer Black man, I use both of those interchangeably, I guess, means that more often than not, my sisters beat me to the one spot that's there, and I'm thankful for that because I grew up with three women as sisters, and I see even to this day, my youngest sister has more degrees than me, and it has not been easy for her. So I don't, for me, I see that there's still a lot of work to be done on all levels, and I don't disparage anybody for getting their spot, because I think there needs to be more space for everybody. By the way, that also includes more white men, I think, as well. And yeah. I know that sounds, wait, you're contradicting yourself, but it's really not a contradiction. There are some instances in which, it would be nice to hear from a white male, because their perspective just isn't being heard either,
in yoga, maybe.
At least give, yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm not, yeah, let me clarify that.
Yeah.
In the yoga therapy world, even in the yoga world, let's just go there, because I think in yoga therapy that there might be some counter arguments that would be appropriate there. There are plenty of white men in yoga therapy, I think, as well, but maybe in yoga in general, there might not be. In terms of, I don't know. As I think about this, maybe I'm talking off, as we might say, talking out the side of my neck. I would like to at least honor the fact that we need at least some spaces where white men can feel comfortable to speak their piece. And I don't know that that's always happening in an environment where the dialogue isn't about one-upsmanship. It seems like often when these conversations around ethnicity, identity, around gender, and economics come up, we don't have enough people at the table to have an honest discussion. And so, of course, the discussion winds up being lopsided or argumentative in a way that's not productive.
Yeah. And so how in terms of interoceptive awareness, has being in this ocean for the last 30 plus years, have you had feelings of acceptance, belonging? Has it been feeling maybe like there's danger? I'm just curious.
All of that, all of that, and probably a lot more. As I think about the question you just raised, I remember the very early days when I was not only the only guy in the room, but certainly the only guy of color in the room. And, you know, a room of, maybe, 20 women, all white women, who I either had to teach yoga to, that was certainly an experience as well, or I was practicing right next to, and sometimes that was comfortable for them as well as for me. And sometimes it really wasn't comfortable for either of us. So it's forced me to learn a lot about how I behave in my body with women and with people who are not of my ethnicity, in terms of making myself comfortable, as well as trying to provide some comfort for them, And it's interesting. I think I used to feel like my early days on the East Coast studying yoga, my job is to make sure that they feel comfortable. Well, that's a huge burden, and I didn't realize it was a burden. And when I let go of that burden and let go of the idea that I needed to always be educating around those issues, it just made it easier for me to breathe and just be a yogi, just practice, right? Roll my mat out and let it be a practice for me.
Yeah, I mean, what I just heard you say was around taking it from that external focus of what's going on out there and who's around me and how are they feeling? Are they to Per is going to go inward now and self-soothe and connect and breathe and feel and have a somatic experience for the next hour and a half or however long the class is. And you found that you could do that.
Yeah, and I think a difference that is really important to highlight is, here's an illustration. A good friend of mine went through the same yoga teacher training program with me, but unlike me, I'm a pretty ectomorphic body type, right? I'm a buckle 5 in terms of weight, and you could blow me over with a stiff breeze. He is, a big, black, very dark-skinned man. And so at some point, I'm not sure even when it was, I began to notice the distinction. People would gravitate their mats towards mine, but they wouldn't towards him. And I kept thinking, what's this about? Is it because he's a big guy? Well, that might be. I mean, there's a part of that, but I just had to believe it wasn't just his physical presence. There were other things going on that maybe they weren't even aware of, It's unconscious, I think.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. I mean, I was raised by civil rights activists, and I can honestly say until 5, 6 years ago, I really didn't understand the problem. I was unaware that there was a problem. I was just doing my thing, not realizing that there were not seats at the table for people like you, and that we actually had to clear out places and say, you belong, you're accepted, you're loved, we care, we want to be in relationship together, right? And then that just shows the privilege that I wasn't even aware that people were being excluded from the yoga and yoga therapy table.
Yeah. Privilege. It's an interesting word, and I know it's important to use this word. I think there's value in it. As I think about it, the use of the word privilege and having everyone look at their sense of privilege, which is so important for men in particular, myself included, right? Because I'm a privileged guy, and I don't make any bones about that. I'm college educated. I've had the opportunity to study with people that other folk won't get the opportunity to study with because of who they are. But I think in addition to that, it's important to recognize the place where disenfranchisement is a word choice we can make as well about some of these dynamics. And I think there's a difference between those two words, and it's an important one, because when we talk about privilege to people who don't recognize, they're just a little fish swimming in this big ocean, right? They don't realize that the water current is different for them than it is for other people. When we use the word privilege, we forget that they can sometimes be disenfranchised as well. You know, like straight white men in a yoga class, because they're not going to be more than, say, 5 of them in your typical yoga class, right? They're not going to be more than 5 of them typically, right? It's mostly women. And so that's, in a sense, a spot where for them, they probably feel disenfranchised. But when we turn the lens and say that's what's happening to people of color or to women, they don't see it because their mind isn't directed in that way. So it's important to use these words and use lots of words in a way that people can understand them. And so I just wanted to bring that up because I think, I know the rationale behind using privilege is to turn the lens so that people understand what is happening from their experience. You are privileged in relationship to me, but we have to turn it the other direction as well and realize those people are enfranchised in a way that I'm not, or you're not, because you're female, or whatever the case may be. You know, people with disabilities also would come in here.
Right.
Based on how we create our society. Yeah.
100%. And yeah. And then when you add, you know, another layer in the yoga world of being queer on top of it, I remember you had told me a story about something that happened in Kripalu, which I don't know if you're comfortable telling that story. It's I don't know if it's funny, but it's telling.
Yeah.
Do you mind, or is that too much?
I don't mind at all. So I began as a yoga teacher at Kripalu years ago, and anyone who's ever been to Kripalu knows that they have a wonderful steam sauna. Steam, is it steam? No, it's a wet sauna. I think they've also got steam, or at least they used to, I think. But anyway, this was a wet sauna experience, and they're communal, right? They're sex separated, so people who identify as women go to a designated area for women, and people who identify as male go to a designated area for the men and get in the whirlpools. And it, you know, after doing, you know, a full day of 8 hours of yoga practice, or you know, maybe not 8 hours, but a long day of yoga practice, it's a real nice way to kind of wrap your day up. So I'm sitting in the whirlpool, and you know, there are a bunch of men down there, and as I remember it, you know, we were men who'd all had, you know, a kind of relationship. We knew a little bit about each other prior to this, so we're all,
because you had been in class together, right?
Because we've been in class together, we've been in teacher trainings together, and we're all now nude, and that's perfectly acceptable and normal. And you know, there's nothing weird about it. You know, it's not an inherently sexualized environment. They're all yogis, right? But we're talking about our lives, right? And I mentioned my husband. The whole sauna got deadly silent. Or actually, at that point, he wasn't my husband. He was just my boyfriend. We were dating at that point, but we've been in a long-term relationship, and we're now married. And the room, you could literally hear the water dripping off the ceiling into the water, because I'd said something that had outed myself. And I'm a little, sometimes I do it accidentally and without thinking about it, and sometimes I do it on purpose as a way of validating a queer identity, right? To me, that's a part of what it means to be queer, to make people a little bit uncomfortable, right? Yeah. That's a part of I think a part of yoga as well. We don't want to be too comfortable. And so that's exactly what happened. And slowly, one by one, people began, oh, you know, it's getting really late. Let me get up and get out. And finally, I was the only one sitting in the tub there. And it was, you know, it was like, okay, I see what happened here. You know, the fact that I revealed that I'm in a relationship with a man has made people feel really uncomfortable. Whereas a few seconds before, I was just another guy, you know? So these are the kind of things I think that, you know, would help people to recognize that privilege enfranchisement thing that I was talking about earlier. you know.
Absolutely.
If you create space for all people and don't make any assumptions about who they are in the beginning, it'll make the world a much safer place for everybody.
So do you have any thoughts for us on the work that we can do on ourselves so that we can show up and create safe spaces as yoga teachers, yoga therapists? I think there's so many of us that our eyes are being opened to LGBTQIA plus, you know, people and the life experience that they're having that's so different than maybe if you're a cisgender person, um, you know, people of color, BIPOC. I think people are in the yoga world are waking up to the fact that, wow, this has been pretty messed up for a really long time and we got to do something. So I know we have Gail Parker coming next week to help us also unpack this race-based trauma injury, but especially with respect to LGBTQIA plus people, do you have any thoughts for us on the work we need to be doing as yoga teachers, yoga therapists, or even body mind practitioners?
You know, I think the example that we were just talking about would have been a wonderful one if instead of just moving away, someone would have simply said, "Oh, really? So what's that like? You know, I've never met a queer guy before. What's it like to be in a relationship with another dude? You know?"
Mm,
And then we could have a conversation about that, and perhaps as a result of that conversation, we begin to understand that his girlfriend and my boyfriend, in terms of how we relate to one another, it's not different, you know, or the differences that are there are about things that really don't really matter in the long run, you know, because we're both human. Those are the kind of scenarios that in my mind I think about in terms of sexual identity and ethnicity and race-based issues that would make a difference. When you don't know, decenter your perspective for a brief moment. Take that pause that I was talking about earlier in terms of the work we do in yoga therapeutics, as I understand it, right? Where I'm looking at you and you're looking at me. There's a spot in between, and that's the sweet spot. Ask a question rather than assuming you know, and then step away, you know, step away
and
to
what do you
something that expands.
and what do you say to, I mean, you had mentioned earlier, like you just naturally help to educate people, but over time that gets very tiring. I can only imagine to always be the one. So if someone in that, you know, steam room had said, tell me more about that. I've never really met a queer man in yoga that is getting married. And would you have felt comfortable to also say, you know, I'm really tired tonight and I don't feel like, you know, educating you at this time. You know, here's some websites, here's some, I'll be sure to get them to you in class tomorrow or something.
Yeah,
Would you
and I
say
think
that?
that's a yeah, I think that's a perfectly valid way of doing it. And I guess at this point in my life, I certainly have gotten to a point where, you know, like along issues of ethnicity and race, where I had to college days for me were constant on that front. I felt like I was constantly trying to educate people about what it meant to be a person of color in a
Mm,
small private liberal arts college, and I got exhausted. I got burned out, literally. So I don't, you know, there are times when I, I I don't want to talk about that. Is that okay? And you know, luckily, I'm in a space where I don't have to unless I really want to. Um, but I think even with that being the case, there's a space where if you decenter, like for me, sometimes if I feel like, oh, this is an issue around women, for example, you know, even though I grew up with three women, four
mm,
women, if you include my mom, right? I don't know everything about women's issues. I would be a fool to assume that I do. And so my job is to decenter my perspectives and then go and do my own research. Don't
right.
expect the women that I work with to teach me, you know? But if I
100%.
ask a question about their lives, that's a little bit different. They can respond or not respond, but the way that it's approached there is about the one-on-one connection between us, as opposed to teach me about this issue, right? As it relates to women.
Right.
which is remarkably different, I think.
You know, I completely agree with you. And there's this amazing gentleman who's a CIYT. He's studying to be a medical doctor, and he has something on Instagram called Queer Storytime, where he's had 12 of them. His name is Stephen Ingram, and I'll put his notes in the show notes. But basically, for 12 episodes now, and he's going strong, he'll take an hour and interview a queer person or a trans person, and I am learning so much about languaging and my own biases and what life is like and how to have empathy. And I feel so happy that he's willing to do this. He's a white queer man, but he's helping people like me who want to come to my yoga therapy sessions educated and not expecting my clients to educate me, right? I'm here for them. I need to decenter myself, right? He is doing such amazing work in the world to help me understand this whole area, which I have been pretty unconscious about, you know? And
Yeah,
I'm just
yeah.
appreciative of that.
Geez, now I wish I was on Instagram. I could. I'll have to look him up anyway.
You have to. You know, his kind of handle, if anybody's interested, and my husband and I will eat dinner and we'll watch Queer Story Time, and it sometimes I feel really, really emotional about it because he's doing such amazing work in the world. I'm just going to see. So his handle on Instagram is called Future MD Yogi, all one word, Future MD Yogi, and his given name is Stephen Ingram. And like I said, if people want to know about queer issues, you know, LGBTQIA plus, go sit and watch these people showing themselves and taking the time to educate us. You know, it's a beautiful thing.
See, that's the thing. Yeah, in the 21st century, if you can't find someone who's out in any of these particular areas that you don't know anything about, and kind of as I've been talking about, decenter your own perspective, whatever that perspective might be. I'm not saying it's wrong or bad. Like my perspective as a queer guy of color, that's me, right? That's wonderful. But it's not the only one in the world. And in the 21st century, there are resources everywhere. People on TikTok and Instagram and, you know, YouTube, you name it. If you can't find one person who's out there telling their story, their narrative about what it means to be alive, you're not looking hard enough, right?
You're just not.
That's really what it boils down. Yeah.
And that goes for every single category or type of people we might be interested in. And to your point, people who we may from the outside think, oh, they're in that category, have completely different perspectives, right? Just like every human being on earth is a unique culmination of the experiences they've had in their lives. So I think hearing that's what I love about Queer Storytime, is that I've heard 12 of them now, each one very unique and different, you know? So, Per, is there anything else? We're getting close to the end of our time together. Is there anything else that you wanted to share today around somatics, embodiment, interoceptive awareness, helping us to understand you a little bit better? Is there anything else that you want to share?
I don't think so. Nothing comes to mind.
Okay.
Other than great appreciation and enthusiasm for the work you do in the world. I'm a little bit of an Amy Wheeler fan, but I really appreciate not just this podcast that you're doing, this service that you're doing for the community, but all the other things that I've heard of you doing in the past from my good friend Ruth, our mutual good friend Ruth, and the things I see you doing on a regular basis online. I mean, it's really wonderful and inspiring to see your dedication to what it means to human thriving. So in that respect, You and I are colleagues.
Yes, we are twin souls. And I was just thinking this morning that the work that you do and I do and many of us do in this world, we use yoga therapy or somatic education as our channel or our venue to do it, but it's really about human connection and human thriving. And you could also be a minister, or you could also be a teacher or a policeman or a janitor or a cook. This is just the chosen way that we're choosing to connect and connect with others and really be together in this world. And I personally like this choice of yoga therapy as the way that I choose to connect, but it really wouldn't matter what the job, don't you think?
Absolutely. I've said for a long time, I never had any, initially, I didn't think I'd be a yoga teacher. I was going to be an actor. That's what I thought until I became a social worker. I became a yoga teacher and then the Tai Chi teacher. And so it's an interesting journey, and I'm just along for the ride and happy that I stumbled across you in this vast ocean.
And who knows what else you'll be doing in 5, 10, or 15 years. you know we keep learning and growing. Oh, well, thank you so much, Per. It was really a pleasure to have you today. And if you think of anything after this, let me know and we can put it in the show notes. If you want to share your website, well, why don't you share your website with us in case people want to experience somatics with you, like I have.
Absolutely. So my website is a little bit long in the tooth, but it's www.bear, all one word, bear as in BAR, essentialsyoga.com. www.bearessentialsyoga.com. You can find more information than you probably want on there, including a way to register for my regular Wednesday mid-afternoon class for somatic, what I call group somatic yoga and movement exploration.
Which I have so loved, and then some of the students and colleagues that I've told them about have also loved. It's just a really, really lovely experience. So, okay, well, thank you so much, and we will talk again soon. And when I say goodbye, everything goes dark here.
Okay, gotcha.
All right. Thanks, Per. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.